So welcome, welcome to NEW302. So here we are, and it's the end of the first semester. This is the halfway mark, and from here, it's quite hasty. I apologize for the slight lateness on this video. As I mentioned, my building was testing the fire alarm at random but persistent intervals, basically for 3 days at the end of last week. And then when I sort of came to Friday night, I thought, who is watching this Friday night? Nobody is watching this Friday night. Indeed, if it is not the case that you are studying for an exam or working on some kind of final assignment over the weekend, then you are enjoying well-deserved rest. So I decided that given that it is the end of the semester, that nobody was champing at the bit for this. Hence, I am planning to release it sort of across 3 parts. This is the first. The second, I imagine I will record and probably post tonight. The third, which is the Watchmen piece, which I have been promising, has to wait slightly. I'm waiting on something, and I don't want to say more than that. But I'm waiting on the arrival of something, at which point I will record that one. It's a bit standalone in any event, useful, of course, to compare against things. But as I said, we have a bit of a spacious gap at this point in sort of the schedule and course of the year, since we don't meet again for what, six weeks? 6 weeks? No, 5 weeks? Quite a while. Yeah, so I shall post that one as soon as the thing that I am waiting for arrives. But in the meantime, I wanted to take some time. First off, I will post some sort of guidelines upcoming, probably towards, frankly, the beginning of next semester. I'm just going to advocate a little bit more closely for sort of tighter response time to your peers' presentations, but mostly for their benefit, so that they can, get an adequate amount of feedback to pen their post-presentation responses. I will say that the presentations so far have been excellent. So I think everybody should be commended for presentations are hard for people, right? Presentations in person, not for everybody, obviously. For some people, they're a preferred form. But for many people, they're quite difficult. And I think in some ways, actually, this format shift has introduced a considerable advantage to people to sort of marshal their thoughts and organize things and so on and so forth without having the immediacy of eyes. For other people, it's a little trickier. I must admit that I still find this particular format slightly odd. It's not that I can't, record things. It's just that sort of speaking without the immediacy of sort of, a classroom, or if you're, talking about a conference or something, an audience, it's still a little bit foreign to me. However, I will say that over the course of the semester, weekly or near weekly recording has gone a considerable distance towards sort of, I guess, rendering that a more fluent enterprise. Anyway, the quality of the presentations has been excellent, and I hope that people keep them up. If people are behind on presentations, they're still there. So go watch them. In many cases, however, that means your feedback has come a bit late for your peers. So for the second semester, I want to try to sort of impose like 2 weeks. I'll push back the response time on things to accommodate accordingly, but it's like try to respond within 2 weeks. Okay. And particularly in terms of the quizzes, but also obviously the discussion questions. Okay, that's the logistics piece. So the topic for today is Coniunctio. But in fact, that's sort of a half-truth, if you'll permit the pun, because in fact it's really lesser Coniunctio. You have probably noticed, I mean, if you've paid attention to sort of the upcoming lectures and stuff, that the course is sort of structured in this case into sort of two broad loops. So we've converged on Coniunctio, but we're only at the halfway mark, right? And in some ways, sort of the greater Coniunctio is, seen within the alchemical work as being, the pinnacle of the art. There are, of course, transformative stages post-Coniunctio, which we'll talk about at greater length when we get to alchemy, the multiplicatio, that is hard to say in Latin. Those of you that have been keeping up on the readings, and particularly the Edinger reading, which if you have not read, is extremely, I think, lucid and clarifying, with the caveats that I typically apply to Edinger. But the Coniunctio reading, which is posted on Quirkus, is nevertheless a nicely clarifying text in terms of sort of getting a sense of the depth psychological underpinnings of what it is that we're talking about in relatively lucid and practical terms. So as I mentioned, this lecture is the Coniunctio, but properly speaking, it is the lesser Coniunctio. And the reason is a fewfold. One, it's an excellent place for us to pause, as a sense, in the processing of the material that comes before it, right? At this point, my expectation is that most of you have a pretty solid grasp on, probably several, at the very least, of the kind of core archetypes complexes. Very possibly not all of them. There will be some that will be sort of persistently resistant. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. In fact, that resistance can be a bit of a guidepost for where to direct your attention if you want to sort of yield, interesting output. However, the assumption is that you probably have a pretty decent grasp on a bunch of them. And indeed, at this point, if you have not, I would encourage you to reflect a bit on how these dynamics reflect the instances of your own life. It's of course the training ground for much of this stuff to do interpretation within fictional forms, right? It's externalized and thus a bit sanitized. The charge is reduced. That makes it a sort of a valuable locus to be able to isolate these things. And in some cases, they appear in a dramatized and exaggerated form, right? Which really lets you kind of pick it out. And that's why a lot of these texts have been chosen. And doing that kind of interpretive work is valuable in its own right. I'm something of a proponent of the idea of the grand argument story, which is the idea that when we are taking in a story, essentially speaking, the different components of our psyche project to different characters, right? So what we might conventionally think of as the protagonist attracts the attention of our ego. That's who we associate with most closely. But really what we're looking at is a kind of dialectic, snapshot is a bit too static, but it's kind of, dialectic parsing and representation in symbolic form of the operations of the mind itself, right? That the story is not solely about, a narrative of a bunch of minds interacting, but can be seen and indeed, sort of interacts with us as a mind interacting with itself. I sometimes think about the work and I was recently, I sometimes think about the work. I often think about the work. What I mean is I sometimes think about the work in a particular way, which I'll talk about quickly. So I saw a device the other day, which I thought was actually totally brilliant. It was for cleaning out glassware. So like, it's over there, but like I have a big bulbous wine carafe. If some of you have seen my alchemy video, actually the carafe is in there. My 4-hour alchemy video. The carafe is in there. And those things are notoriously extremely difficult to clean out. You kind of can't get your hand in there, and you can sort of get a brush in there, but getting into the corners is tricky. And if you've ever sort of scrubbed, lab glass, right? Erlenmeyer flask and that kind of thing, you may find something similar. It's like getting that little brush into the corners is always tricky. So cleaning these things is hard. And this particular device, I thought, was exceptionally clever. Basically, it was 2 magnets, one of which was embedded within a kind of like, you know, stiff bristled or like rubber bristled kind of cleaning brush. So the idea was that you had, you know, the object and you dropped it in, and then the other thing stuck it on the other side of the glass, at which point you could move the magnet around on the outside, right? Move the magnet around on the outside, and it would be able to scrub into the corners, because through the binding of the two, even though the glass is separating it, right, the force that binds them, you can kind of get into the corners. And I'm often reminded by something that in turn has reminded me of, which is a toy that my grandmother used to talk about having when she was a kid, which was sort of a little magnetized pair of dogs with sufficiently strong magnetism, I guess, that, you know, you could put them on the top and bottom of, I suppose, a fairly thin table. And then you could, of course, move the bottom dog around, and the top dog would appear to move under its own power. You know, kind of a neat little toy. So I was thinking about this, and you know, when we are doing analysis on stories, like I said, it's separated out from us, but the notion of the grand argument story, not a Jungian notion, but the notion of the grand argument story really does draw from that kind of psychodynamic perspective, right? The parts in the story draw the parts of our mind, right? Where characters exist in dialectical conflict, parts of our mind exist in dialectical conflict. And a static story, you know, or rather a story is dynamic, but the outcome of a story, right, is running a certain kind of premise on us. This owing to this analysis owes a little bit to the dramatic work of Lajos Egri, who I recommend for those of you who are writers, if you've not heard of him. And the idea is, you know, there's a premise, there's a question in the story, typically expressed in a dialectic pair, you know. So, you know, keep the faith or betray, you know, be true to yourself or cave in, you know, emotions or reason. These are the kinds of things that stories concern themselves with, because stories intrinsically concern themselves with conflict. And the resolution of that conflict is meant to represent a kind of premise, right? That, you know, all conditions being just so, like this, right? This is the outcome. In a sense, it's a kind of a dialectical simulator, if you will. So doing analysis on stories is useful. It's good training. They're a bit more simplified. You know, there's an advantage to that. But of course, ultimately speaking, this material is not, you know, it's not primarily a literary theory. It's a philosophy, properly speaking, but in addition to that, it's a psychology of intentional growth. You know, it's intended to be the theoretical framework that provides for the tools that lead you to be more yourself, resolve your issues, and have a better life. I mean, that is ultimately why it matters, right? And so I hope that for, you know, those of you who have got a grasp on these things, if you haven't been, you start taking a look at yourself, take a look at your own inner machinery, take a look at the conflicts that haunt you, and conflicts both in terms of just like, you know, a direct opposition that you have somewhere, but also, and that somewhere could be outside of yourself or inside yourself, but also, of course, the states of ambivalence that you find yourself in. You know, it's, I think, under-recognized in many cases how terrible ambivalence can feel, right? To feel torn between things. There's an interesting book, which is something of a therapeutic mainstay on couples therapy. It's called Too Good to Leave, Too Bad to Stay. It took me a second. I was trying to remember which order those were in. Too Good to Leave, Too Bad to Stay. And it talks about ambivalence in relationship, right? And how difficult it can be if one is, you know, in a romantic relationship. Although I add, these principles could be theoretically applied into any number of relationships. It's not exclusively a romantic question. But to be like, do I stay or do I go? Right? To quote The Clash, do I stay or do I go? And how difficult that can be. Now, that is an ambivalence that you can abstract out, as I said, to any number of relationships, including relationships that you have with yourself, relationships that you have with structures in the world, relationships that, you know, have worked for you for a long time, but maybe you have the mounting sense are not working for you anymore. And the question is, you know, do I end this? Do I keep going? Should I be steadfast? You know, or does something have to change, right? Does something substantial have to change? These are the kinds of problems that we really face. So I hope that, you know, at this point, people are beginning, and I know some people are, but I hope people are beginning to think about how this stuff applies back. If you want an intermediate stage, of course, you can run a little bit of armchair analysis on, you know, instances of people that you know, but nothing really substitutes for doing that, you know, oneself. And it is, of course, as I've said many times, a kind of indispensable advantage to be able to do it in concert with somebody who is trained and knows their way around. So being in therapy makes a difference. But that isn't the whole of the story, obviously, because even if you're in therapy, the work really gets sort of primed in therapy, maybe focused in therapy, but it occurs outside of therapy. It occurs between session. It's on your time. You're doing the work on your time. Now, one of the reasons that this week is the lesser coniunctio is this. However it is that you are currently thinking about this material, and I hope that you feel that you have, you know, a pretty decent grasp, at least on the core principles at this point. And I know that it's easy to be uncertain about that. But nevertheless, whatever your appreciation is, it's, I would wager, almost certainly lesser coniunctio, which is to say, there are deep, profound elements of this, and I am not making the claim to be some kind of exalted, advanced possessor of those things. I have been doing this a long time, I'll say that, but that doesn't keep me from getting surprised. And when you have been doing this work for a long time, you start to rack up a certain number of these things in the rearview mirror. You start to be able to reflect backwards on these lesser coniunctios and on these instances of projection and so on and so forth. You start to be able to interpret your past in those terms. And, you know, when it comes to the theoretical component, okay, even if you have a complete theoretical mastery at this point of the material that you've encountered, until that theoretical mastery is wed to phenomenological experience, to emotional reality, to intuition, right? To the fullness of being, right? And the state of being in the world, that's not a full coniunctio, it's a lesser coniunctio. And in fact, I would probably say that if that is the lesser coniunctio, right, that one finds themselves in, right, that they grasp these things in abstract terms, or maybe have worked out sort of the systemics of the language and the jargon and stuff, but haven't quite penetrated through, or have gotten certain instances, it's the very definition of a lesser coniunctio. There will be an entanglement between you and certain aspects of this work, right? That entanglement sometimes will be positive, sometimes it'll be negative, but the point is, you have to keep going. And hopefully in the second half of this course, we'll keep going together. So, you know, when we talk about the lesser coniunctio, you know, anytime that the ego gets exceptionally tangled up with one of its archetypes, one of its complexes, you're going to have typically some kind of lesser coniunctio if there is sort of a strong identification. And I would say even actually if there's a super strong disidentification, okay? So the coniunctio, as I've mentioned, you know, is a kind of later phase alchemical operation, and it follows the basic alchemical operations of solve et coagula, right? Dissolve and coagulate. Bring it together, take it apart, bring it together, take it apart, right? And we could use other terms. We could say analysis and synthesis, for instance. You know, so when we are considering, for instance, the various forms of knowledge inquiry that we use in the world, right? There has been a sort of a really massive, substantial emphasis, for instance, on the kinds of techniques that we have taken out of things like physics, right? And I've talked about, atom smashers, particle accelerators, right, as being things, if you think about CERN in Switzerland, this is this giant magnetic track designed to accelerate matter and hurl it at very high speed into other matter and then watch the pieces that fly off, right? And this is a way to do science, take things apart. For hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, right, the prohibition against sort of examining the anatomy of the dead kept us from having a particularly good understanding of, medically speaking, what was going on anatomically inside people. We had to take it apart to understand it, right? And in general, that analytical technique has served science well. But there has been a countervailing movement, and to be honest, the roots of this actually go back quite far. So Goethe was big into this, the German intellectual Goethe, kind of polymath. But there has been a sort of a call to a sort of a synthesis, a counterpoint, to appreciate things in their dynamic whole, right? To seek towards a kind of ecological validity, right? And, ecology is a leading edge on this. It's all well and good to examine, a particular species in isolation. But really, when you're dealing with complex interrelated sets of dependent factors and feedback loops and, right, parasitic and commensal and competitive and altruistic, like the networks between various life forms, right, are something that massively exceeds whatever your expectations based on the small, removed part when you look at a single organism would be. And so, there is a move towards sort of examining things in that context, right? To try to take context itself into consideration and look at things in this ecological way. So analysis and synthesis, right? We sort of take things apart in this sense, right? So, when we drill in and when we're sort of drilling in on our own experience, we necessarily get tangled together with the aspects of this stuff that are charged for us. There are going to be particular kinds of aspects, right? Particular kinds of, complexes that really draw our attention. That might manifest itself in an extremely strong interest, right? And sort of an absorption into it. It might manifest itself in terms of an extremely strong resistance, right? And that resistance can be at multiple levels, right? It can be an emotional resistance to the contemplation of the idea. It can be an intellectual resistance, right? That the idea remains opaque. And some of these things, of course, are subtle, so they take longer to get to in some very important sense. But, in general, we're going to, find that each of us has a different sort of entanglement or a different sort of ambivalence, right? And when we start to think about these things in categorical terms, that can serve a little bit to abstract them and allow us to lift them out of context long enough to look at them more easily. But eventually one needs to put them back into their natural ecology, as it were, right? The interacting forces within the mind and get a sense, again, of what the story as a whole that one is going through is. So I would encourage people to reflect on that. If you want a little bit of an aid in that respect, I would encourage you to turn your attention back to the watchword matrix that you filled out quite a while ago. So I provided you guys with something of a key. I will expand that when it comes up in the assignment, but, pull it out. It's been a few months. And, it's been a highly unusual few months, right, for everybody. If you want to talk about kind of chemical containment in a certain sense, you can think a little bit about the sorts of stresses, emotional stresses, and conflicts and stuff that were produced by lockdown, right? Having people in small spaces together or isolated from each other, or, right, that kind of containment, right? It built pressure, psychological pressure, real psychological pressure. That had disparate effects on all kinds of people. Some people experienced really intense loneliness. Some people were initially, right, thrilled, right? Finally, separation from the world. separation from obligation, and social excuse to engage in social distancing. For many people, they found themselves in living situations not by themselves, but nevertheless alone in some important way, or in sort of outright conflict, and alone in that sense. And then we let the clamps off a bit over the summer. Not quite as much as people apparently believed, but everybody was cooped up. Now the weather was nice; they could go outside, and people started to let things slip, right, a little bit. And now we're back into a second lockdown, and we're moving towards, in terms of its position within the seasons, the darkest day of the year. And things are not great on this situation right now. I think people are aware of that. But there is also a promise of things moving forward. So we're moving back into a kind of containment. For many of you, actually, you may find that the lull in classes, that weekly routine of classes, represents a sort of a jarring return to a state of being bottled up. Nevertheless, it's a good time to do this kind of work. So what I'm suggesting here has less to do with, obviously, read the texts, watch the presentations, right? Absorb the materials. But what I'm really advocating for here is for you to take some spacious downtime over the holidays and take that time as reflective time. One of the reasons that I have the kind of liberal policy that I have around extensions and so on and so forth is that it's extremely difficult to do the useful work in a reflective sense when you are under extreme pressure. Things happen under extreme pressure, but the examination of them typically requires somewhat calmer and more spacious conditions, right? You need free time. You need to be able to breathe. You need to be able to walk around, take a tree bath, which is to say walk through some woods, right? And get showered in delightful phytochemicals. You need to be able to, turn off the chatter, turn off the phone, step away from other people, go out into the crisp with just you and your thoughts for an hour or two, and see in that reflective space what starts to sort of shake out. What are the observations? Where are you at? And I'm hoping that people will, bring that to bear, but this isn't academic research in that sense. This is about grounding out your understanding. And again, my sincere hope is that as we move forward into the second half of the course, that's deepened and complexified. Because the thing about dissolve et coagula, right, the dissolve and coagulate is precisely that. It is an integration and a differentiation. And one does this over and over and over again. You pull it apart and try to pull apart the impurities, right? You fuse it back together and see if you can get something more elevated, synthesized out of it. And the thing is that is in some sense prelude. And we're going to talk more about the greater Coniunctio next semester, but there is such a thing as a simultaneity, right? That there can be a simultaneity, right? That the opposites can be considered in some very important sense side by side, or even synthesized into something more than that, something that has depth. Okay, and to speak to that specifically, I want to talk a little bit about paradox, and I want to talk about the idea of paradox as power source. Paradox as power source. However, before we do that, I want to tell you a short story. So I have a friend. I have a bunch, I guess, but this particular friend, I have a friend who, for his wedding anniversary one year, and it would have been pretty late, maybe his 50th wedding anniversary. That's very possible. It seems plausible, but it might be too plausible. That might be too good a story. It could have been his 40th. Anyway, certainly it was a later anniversary of his marriage. He wanted to get something specific and symbolic. So he went on eBay, I think, although maybe he actually, Now that I think about it, I think maybe he actually bought it through an antique dealer. Yeah, see, I'm conflating this together, but okay, I do know the story, I swear. So, okay, so yes, actually he bought it through an antiques dealer. So he's at an antiques dealer and he finds this ring. And the ring is quite striking. It's very beautiful. It turns out that it's quite old. That is to say that it's a late Roman era ring. That kind of stuff is purchasable, but it's a late Roman era ring. And the sheen of the metal in it is really sort of eye-catching. And when he investigates a little bit further, he finds out that the ring is made of electrum. Electrum is an amalgam which was used fairly widely through the Roman Empire, but it was an amalgam of silver and gold. So a fusion of silver and gold. So, like it's a decent size. It's a very kind of chunky ring on account of the way that rings used to be made, right? Trickier to make fine bands, and they didn't tend to survive history so well. So it's an amalgam of silver and gold, this Roman era ring. So he buys this thing. And he is particularly interested, right, in it as sort of a second wedding ring. But one of the things that it is missing at the time is it doesn't have a stone. So it was originally designed to accommodate a round cut stone, which had, long since been lost, pried out probably at some point in history. So it had no stone. It's this electrum ring that has no stone. So he's not sure about this. He struggles on this count. He is a Jungian. And so, he's aware that whatever he puts in it, he wants to have, some kind of relatively powerful symbolic resonance. And then finally, he comes across, again, I believe in an auction, but presumably not of antiques per se. So I'll have to ask him. But he comes across a small coprolith. What's a coprolith? So a coprolith, basically, is fossilized droppings. So, fossilization, when it occurs with organisms, can sort of mineralize all different parts of their body. And so in some cases, of course, we basically get, bones that have turned to stone, right? And in some cases we get, sort of a vitreousness, like glass-like quality in some cases to organisms if they are fossilized in particular ways. And a coprolith is fossilized droppings. It's fossil shit, right? It's fossil shit. That's a coprolith. So he finds this coprolith and he immediately realizes that he's found his stone. So he has this thing cut. Like he takes it to a gemner who cuts it, shapes it, polishes it, the whole thing, and has this thing inset into the ring. And it's a really interesting stone when you look at it. It's obviously, it's sort of shiny. It's pretty clearly sort of a semi-precious stone of some kind, and it has that sort of, the shine that we associate with precious stones. It has that shine to it. But the color is, of course, really peculiar, sort of organic color, as you might expect. Not even totally kind of brown. It's more complicated than that. And so he has this ring, this Roman era electrum, right, ring made of an amalgam of silver and gold, with the stone that was the shit cut and set into it. And obviously already this is an amazingly beautiful magic ring story. This is one of the best things he's ever told me. I've thought about it for years and years. And when I asked him about it, like the idea of having this symbol to celebrate his marriage, his response was really striking to me because he said, well, really, actually, what I'm celebrating here is my inner marriage. And I paused at that because the concept, of course, is familiar to me, the inner marriage, right? This is what we're talking about to some extent when we talk about, like having some kind of meaningful relation with your contrasexual soul image. But, you know, the notion of celebrating that wedding, in some sense, it just, I mean, weirdly, it hadn't occurred to me. The idea that such a thing might occur in a ritual context, I mean, that made sense to me. And, you know, that obviously I thought about it, so on and so forth. But here he was sort of celebrating this event that had occurred for him. Now, he's been Jungian for a long time, and he's a guy with a lot of interesting experiences and background careers. Yeah, he's a fascinating fellow, and I admire him greatly. And this particular act, this marking, this sacralization, this this celebration of a landmark at some level of his inner work. And let's make no mistake, I don't think if you were to ask, he would claim that inner work is by any means finished. And I find it perpetually fascinating where the sort of the focuses of his other attention are in terms of archetypal work. Like, I don't think he would ever claim by any stretch that his situation is complete. And yet here he is, and he's celebrating something. And essentially speaking, in some ways, he's celebrating a kind of lesser Coniunctio, And I thought that was interesting. It was interesting. Very powerful. I think about that ring a lot, actually. I have a ring of my own, which is an heirloom. It was an antique also. My father owned it before me. It's platinum. It has it's set with an opal, cracked opal. And I got this ring. I coveted it for a long time, since I was a child. I mean, it was my father's ring. My father only ever had a couple pieces of jewelry. He had this ring. And he had a bracelet made of a nail, or at least having the appearance of being made of a nail. And my sister laid claim to that bracelet many, many years ago. She doesn't own it, but she sort of tagged it on the will. And I was always interested in this ring. And my father stopped wearing it at some point. But when I turned 18, he gave it to me. Now, properly speaking, he didn't give it to me actually when I turned 18, because I turned 18 in May. And I turned 18 in May, and we weren't on great terms, to put it lightly. I had been kicked out of the house, in no small part because my father found out that I wasn't really going to school. I had other ideas at the time. I just wasn't invested in school, essentially speaking. Now, of course, in retrospect, I think about it, and of course I picked up, plenty of valuable stuff. And I look back, especially in the pandemic conditions, in sort of like no small wonderment to a time period where I went to a building, and of course, classes and whatever, and the density of the school day. It's like to go through a bunch of different subjects, and then also maybe gym, and also drama, and right, like this kind of like dense day. But also looking back on it as a fascinating period. I mean, I can't think of really that many times in my life when I have been sort of mandated to go to a location where the odds were I was going to hang out with my friends every single day. Well, it's rare, right? Anyway, but the point was I'd had a falling out with school. And as many people do, I kept this concealed because I didn't feel like dealing with the repercussions of it. And when this finally came out, my father was, needless to say, extremely unimpressed. And before he actually even sort of said it, I spoke with him on the phone from my mother's house, where I had gone after this whole thing had blown up in my face. I had gone to, sort of catch my breath. And, when I got on the phone with him, a couple of days had gone by after the blow up. And, I said, so I assume I shouldn't come home. And indeed, he was like, yeah, that's right. So, I went, got my motorcycle, Later, my stepsister, packed my shit up and dropped it off. And I was lucky because my parents were divorced in that sense. So I could stay at my mom's place. I had a place to stay there, right? So I didn't immediately have to rethink things. But when my actual birthday rolled around was not that much longer after that. And we didn't see each other. So he gave it to me later. And he gave it to me in a pretty unceremonious way, which is to say that like it didn't come in a box, it wasn't wrapped, it wasn't whatever. I don't recall this being something that we had discussed that much, that I had kind of coveted this thing, but he handed it off to me. And yeah. So here's the thing, I've never worn it because it doesn't fit me. And I have done a variety of things with it. For a while, when I was of no fixed address, I handed it off to a woman who I was very close to kind of hang on to it until I could sort of reclaim it. And then I did. I, weirdly enough, put it on my keychain for quite a while as a way of like having it close, right? And I've known for more than 20 years that I need to have this thing resized if I actually want to wear it. But I have been very frequently resistant to do so. I have often considered, right, getting the stone fixed. I know my father had to have the stone fixed more than once. And the stone split, but it's not, broken out or any such thing. It's fine. But really, the issue is that my hands are much too big to accommodate this particular ring. And so I need to take it to a jeweler and get it upsized. And I have wondered sometimes about, to what extent, right, that's a loaded issue for me. I mean, how much of it was just that platinum is expensive and, historically I was poor. And so I couldn't necessarily, splurge to go get something resized. I could probably afford it now. Although I haven't had a price, who knows. But I've wondered about that. And at times over the course of my life, this ring has taken on sort of various kinds of significance, right? It stood in for milestones. Oh, I'll put it on when this. Oh, I'll put it on when that. In my early 20s, I was like, I'm going to wear it when I have my first real success, right? And I'm not even sure at the time what I conceived of success, my first real success being, my first $1 million. But, I kind of kicked this thing down the road repeatedly in terms of getting it wearable, being able to put it on. Now, this wasn't like some kind of, family heirloom that had been passed down for generations or something. My father bought it at an antique store in Cape Cod, I think, in the 1980s or maybe the 70s. It's maybe a couple hundred years old. It's not an ancient Roman ring, but it carries with it no small amount of significance. So I think about the celebrations of things. I think about the celebration of the alchemical marriage, my friend, having this ring in which he was sort of celebrating, right? The anniversary of his union. And in some ways notice that union is one that points outside. He's talking about his wife, right? And about their relationship and about their kids. And I believe now grandkids, right? He's talking about that, but he's also talking about coming into relationship with some part of himself. And in some ways, those things are co-equivalent. Relationship, frankly, is very often a site where we experience a kind of lesser coniunctio, right? We learn about ourselves in relationships. Jung talks about how any two chemicals, right, if you introduce them to each other, right, you're going to have a reaction. And the personalities basically are like this too, right? When people encounter each other, there's a reaction. And the thing about the reaction is that both chemicals are changed. Encountering people deeply, right, has a way of shifting us, changing us, altering things about us, about the way we think, about the way that we are. And intimate relationships, so much more so, right? There has to be a certain kind of unlocked state and openness, right? To really go to the depths. We have to be trusting in a world that does not always reward trust, right? So we have to be trusting. We have to be vulnerable. We have to be willing to trade in secrets, the currency of intimacy. We have to let people in. And when we do that, we are transformed, whether the relationship is good or bad, or good and then bad, or bad and then good, right? We are transformed by it. And no small amount of that transportation, right? Like the two magnets, the inner attracts the outer, right? The inner attracts the outer. We have our relationship and it's projected into the world, but at the same time, it has a way of altering our relationship to ourselves. And, you know, you learn things. If you overgeneralize your relationships, as I've said before, that's where you start to get baggage, right? It's where you start to get baggage. You overgeneralize, right? So, you know, you've had such and such an experience with such and such a person, and so you decide that that is a more universal rule, perhaps, than it is. You begin to apply it around in your other relationships. And in some cases, those misapplications, right, go, you know, deeper than your premises typically question. They become sort of fundamentals of interaction, right? So, you know, there's a book, Finite and Infinite Games. It's a good book. And, you know, one of the things that it talks about, right, is this idea that, you know, there are sort of zero-sum games and non-zero-sum games, right, is the more kind of common term. And in a zero-sum game, if there's a winner, there's a loser. In a non-zero-sum game, everybody can win. You can have sort of a mutual win. And you can see something a little bit akin to the notion of opposites and paradox and the resolution of paradox into something where it's like, oh, nothing has to lose, right? Nothing has to lose. It's a mistake in many cases to believe that there has to be a loser. But of course, this can be a pattern that we internalize at a really young age, that there's competition, that resources are limited, that, you know, everybody needs a shtick, that if this person is getting what they need, it means I'm not getting what I need, right? Dog eat dog. So in some cases, we have those premises so thoroughly internalized, right, that we no longer see them as premises at all. We just see them as reality. We just see them as being the case. And those kinds of things can be at any number of different kinds of relationships, to relationships that have changed us, that we've overgeneralized from, and so on and so forth. And I think I've drawn a fairly, you know, I think a fairly strong line over the course of this semester in, you know, looking with particular closeness and examination, right, at parental complexes, because parental complexes tend to, in many cases, be at the heart of the way that we relate to others, right? The way that our family works dictates a kind of inner family structure, and that inner family structure structures our sense of the universe, right? The traits that we see or don't see, and the love that we do or do not get within parents and caregivers tends to structure, you know, a vast number of things thereafter. Early on in my sort of therapeutic career, I exclaimed once, with kind of half surprise, I was like, oh my God, like there's always something with the parents, right? There's always something with the parents. And I laughed because it was like, this is so cliche in a way. But, you know, a cliche is just a stripped down archetype. I mean, there usually is something. Well, I've never encountered any case, to be honest, where there wasn't at least some functional issues, because it's a long-standing relationship. And the way that those things carry forward, it's dramatic, right? And often unquestioned. So, yeah. When we're talking about simultaneous integration and differentiation, okay? Simultaneous integration and differentiation. The example that I used earlier was the simultaneous integration and differentiation that occurs in the cellular development of a fetus, right? It was an early instance I used. You know, genetic material comes together, you have a fertilized egg, right? It starts to double itself and double itself and double itself until you have a mass blastocyte of undifferentiated cells. And then at some point, the signal is given and things start to get more complex, which is to say that they're changing into different kinds of cells, right? But they're also simultaneously setting up dense networks of connection, right? Dense networks of communication and of influence between each other. They're still deeply, deeply connected. And even as the cells begin to rearrange themselves into, right, organs, which have, right, not interchangeable structure. You can't, if somebody needs heart transplant, just stick a liver in there, can you? You know, as the system begins to do that, it simultaneously has this extremely rich set of interconnections. It is simultaneously integrated and differentiated. Simultaneously integrated and differentiated. And that is complexification. That's development, right? The same goes, of course, for the psyche. If we think of the archetypes and complexes, these various psychodynamic elements of the mind, bearing in mind, as always, that this is the map, not the territory, but it is picking something out, right? It's picking something out, that there are parts, interacting parts within this overall system. They're the organs of the mind. When you think about it in terms of the grand argument story, it jumps out a little bit more clearly. The grand argument story, right, shows the workings of a mind, in some sense, wrestling with some kind of dichotomy, some kind of problem. How does this resolve? And most stories will tend to resolve in a particular kind of way. They'll come down on one side or another, right? Sometimes that'll be a Pyrrhic victory. You know, the protagonist gets what they want, but you know, it's not so good. And a lot of the time it'll be transformational. The protagonist does not get what they want. And that actually turns out to be a good thing, right? In fact, they grow thereby. And in some cases, it's like, oh, the protagonist does get what they want, just, you know, straight up. Which is to say that, like, a force comes against them, they resist it. There's usually some measure of inner transformation, but at the end of the day, they've reified order in some important sense. Most stories work like that. But there is a small subset of stories, and I'm resistant actually to name these stories. I can think of a couple examples right off the top of my head. Three, right off the top of my head. And I don't want to name them basically because I don't want to spoil the effect, because I'm about to describe it. But the effect is something like this. The stories, which are fairly sort of genre-based, right? They're sort of science fictional, a little bit fantastic, a little bit magical, right? They're not quite entirely grounded in reality. Set themselves up by, you know, by showing conflict, the good guys and the bad guys, the forces of repression and the forces of individualism and freedom. That's how they set themselves up. And they double down on this in lots of ways. They show how terrible and insectile and joyless and, right, awful the forces of repression are, and how far their influence goes, right? That they are the secret movement and master of the world, that they have sort of vast conspiracies and overwhelming force and overwhelming resources. And, right, they are in some sense conspiring to keep their boot on the throat of humanity. And then, of course, there are the sort of counter forces, the good guys, who we are very much encouraged to like, and who you know, are shown to be sort of cool and individualist and have, you know, extreme competence in various ways, and they're clever and they're so on and so forth. And the books, of course, track the clash between these forces. But gradually, ever so gradually, they begin to seed in certain elements that are hard to square in various ways. And over the process of the books, and typically they have to be quite lengthy to achieve this effect, okay? As with many dramatic effects, there's a speed at which we can accommodate change, and it's well reflected in fiction, right? If you consider something like Breaking Bad. Breaking Bad, of course, as many people know, the basic experiment was, can I turn Mr. Chips into Scarface? Mr. Chips being a perennially nice, sweet, right, whatever, and turn him into this ruthless mercenary figure. And that's what Breaking Bad is about. Can you take a basic fuddy-duddy and gradually take him from being the protagonist to being the villain? And it is much acclaimed for a very good reason. It does what it does well. If you tried to make that curve too quickly, try to shift audience sympathy too quickly, it just won't work, right? You have to kind of do it gradually. You have to let people build their attachments before you can make the moves and have them be consequential. Shift things too fast, people either won't buy it or they won't care. It'll rub them the wrong way. So typically the kinds of stories I'm talking about here, they have a long arc. They take you through a lot of things. They let you get really thoroughly invested, right, before they start this move. And gradually, these unexplained little bits that are just sort of dangling, just hovering, spinning in place, start to dissolve the distinctions between the two sides. What has been pointed out originally as this kind of strict binary dichotomy between two sides, good and evil, right? Freedom and repression, is gradually dissolved away. And dissolved away in a kind of deeply existential sense. You start to pull back from the narrative and realize how these two things are, in fact, pieces on a chessboard, right? And therefore part of a game, that they require each other, and that in fact there's less difference between them than you might think. And different books achieve this in different ways. Often it's accompanied by a certain amount of kind of mystical, right, revelatory stuff, depending on the text you're talking about. But nevertheless, right, it gradually dissolves things away. And as it does so, it frees the reader up to this higher perspective. It suddenly takes all of this tension that was built up inside the plot, right, and just releases it. But first, it passes through this intermediary paradoxical stage. This intermediary paradoxical stage. There are things that seem paradoxical, things that seem insoluble. They get distributed through the text here and there. And they don't quite seem to make sense, right? But they raise our hackles just a little bit. And when things are finally revealed, it releases all this emotional energy within the plot. You were highly invested in a conflict. And then the conflict, instead of being sort of like thought out, right, in some sense, is just dissolved. It's dissolved away. And the emotional response to it is really striking. My experience of reading these books, and as I said, I've read a few, and it was only, frankly, afterwards. This is not like a recognized genre or something. Only after the fact, several years after the fact in some cases, did I realize the commonality in the structures of these particular stories. I was writing full-time, and so that made a difference. I was thinking analytically about stories. But it was only really after the fact that it came to my attention that there was a thing here, this really powerful thing, which pulled all of the polarities and stuff apart first, right? Really pulled it all apart to get it to maximum tension, but then, right, did this thing. And rather than having it war back and forth and have one be the victor, it just dissolved that conflict away. And in so doing, produced really fascinating effects. Now, as per grand argument, I think that the reason for this, right, is that these stories reflect something very deep, and that there is a kind of a Russian doll, right, a nested set of coniunctios within coniunctios that we go through. We enter into union with parts of ourselves. Got that just before. We enter into union with parts of ourselves And that union often is unwarranted, right? We are not, in fact, developed enough. We haven't differentiated things. So I mentioned, right, my own sort of lesser Coniunctio experiments with my anima. I was like, I'm tired of being led around by the nose by my romantic commitments. I know what I need to do because I know Jung. And so what I will do is I will just fuse myself, right? And it was an experiment gone wrong. And it was an experiment gone wrong because I hadn't really developed these sides. In fact, I was shirking away from developing them by trying to sidestep the whole thing and just do this Coniunctio business. It was still instructive, highly, highly instructive, albeit painful and frightening, right? It was still highly instructive. And I mean, you know, the dreams that came up out of it were sort of remarkable, and the dreams that served as touch points for understanding, right? This, as I've mentioned before, the kind of bloodless androgyne, which haunted these various dreams of the lake house, you know, served as a platform from which I could understand more general dynamics, that I had created a kind of monster in myself. And that what had to happen was that I had to separate out. I couldn't just decide in my mid-20s that I was like, well, that's it. I'm done with the conflict. And now I know that in order to have healthy relationships, I need to perform this intermarriage and this self-integration. I know that that's true. And the sooner I, you know, marry my anima, the sooner I will have relationships with people that are based on, you know, strictly like mutual respect and a desire for their company, rather than, you know, like craving or projection, or, right? And so that's what I'm going to do. But I hadn't developed my masculine side, for one thing, particularly. In fact, I was very at odds with my father's way of life. What I saw as perceived materiality, the trappings of success, all kinds of other things, right? I pretty clearly was distancing myself from. And distancing myself from in an undifferentiated way, in a highly undifferentiated way, just rejecting all that stuff and causing myself all kinds of problems thereby, right? And I had to spend a lot of time and effort re-entering that world, and, you know, in some cases being swamped by that stuff, right? Letting it take me over again, and then having to gently tease it apart until I had my own relationship with that material. And then I could start thinking about other aspects of the intermarriage. So what am I getting at around all this? I opened in some sense by saying paradox is power source. And I will follow this up in the second video to come as we delve into that a little bit more deeply around some specifics. But, you know, things that are seemingly paradoxical in an important sense, right? Signal to you the places really that in many cases are just limitations of your categories. You see them as paradoxical. They're apparently paradoxical, but they are not necessarily paradoxical, because they are not necessarily as oppositional as you might think of them. And paradoxes can be extremely uncomfortable. Some people delight in them, right? But for other people, they're uncomfortable. They make us feel weird and squirmy, right? Try to overcome that. Try to move towards some, right? Pick some good paradoxes and go right at them. Let them roll around in your head. They don't have to be personal. I'm not talking about necessarily the paradoxes of your own feeling or being, even. I just mean paradoxes in general. Pick a few. Come at them. Let them roll around. Let them make you uncomfortable. See what you can come to. See if you can dissolve the apparent opposition, because it's very good practice for doing the same in yourself. Okay, so with that, we're going to cue to the second part relatively shortly, but yeah, that was sort of introductory stuff around the lesser Coniunctio, and we will talk more in part 2.